Okay, it's showing your photo.
Showing my photo.
Yeah, your account picture on Zoom.
Okay.
Now it's showing you.
Yeah, but this link is different from what I used to broadcast other people. So I need to do some edit.
Hello, Professor Frame.
Good afternoon, Professor. Good to see you.
How's it going? Huh?
Pardon?
No, I cannot turn on my video. Are you controlling?
I was able to see your video, but now I cannot see you.
Yes, because I cannot turn on here.
Okay. Saprit, have you given him co-host?
I think it's not in my control. I just texted you about that. I'm not getting option of.
Okay.
Yeah. Normally, when you click at more, they show the
I
option.
have given him the permission now.
Okay.
Kumar, can you try now? Saprit, maybe I pass you the host.
Okay.
Privilege, then you take care.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Prof. Tanaka, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, Professor Fukuma will be a chair.
Yeah.
田中先生、はじめまして、福間と言います。
田中です。よろしくお願いします。
すいません、なんかビデオが、こんなん初めてなんですけど、なんかカメラオンにできなくて。
あ、そうですか。
すいません、なんかビデオ、なんか開始できませんってメッセージが出てきて。なんでもうこのまま画像なしでも大丈夫ですか？
じゃあちょっとプレムに言っておきます。プレム。
そのままでも大丈夫です。
大丈夫。Now is that, yeah, when I just joined here, then there was no problem, but suddenly it turned off. Then I can turn on again.
Yeah, I think it's fine because I think it's okay. If we,
sorry for
you can try during my talk.
じゃあこのままで大丈夫です。よろしくお願いします。
Is there any cover for the camera? Sliding cover?
No. Because is that I mean that is that they cannot detect the camera. What they mentioned here. I try to turn on here, but what they mentioned that is that no camera installed somehow. That's why I want to restart my computer. That's why later is I will restart, then log in again. After the session starts.
Or you can try to use your phone.
No, phone is fine now. Mic and phone is that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Rashid, good afternoon. Good morning.
Yes, I can hear
Good
you.
morning for us. Good afternoon for you. How are you?
Good. How are you? That's it.
Hi, Tanaka-san. Good to
Yep.
see you.
Good to see you.
Good
after
to see you.
Years.
How are you?
Welcome to BICPAMA.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Pleasure, our pleasure.
Okay, it's time to go.
Maybe we can wait for 1 or 2 minutes. People are still joining.
I can see the beautiful image of NTU. This is really nice. It's really artistic.
Pardon?
I can see the image of NTU. It's really artistic.
Yeah, thank you. This morning we had enabled the chat window, so there were some problem. There were some people with nasty comments, so we disabled the chat.
So we have 15 now.
Yeah, maybe we can start here.
Shall we start the session?
Yeah, please.
Yes, please.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yasuhiro Fukuma from the Kyushu Institute of Technology. I will chair this afternoon session. The first, I want to introduce that the first speaker is the Professor Frame. The title of his talk is the basics of the spin-based neuromorphic computing. Please.
Thank you, Professor Fukuma. Good afternoon to those who are in this part of Asia, and good morning to people who are elsewhere in the world. It's my pleasure to give this talk. So in this seminar, we have people with different expertise, and they are talking about different area, physics, materials, architecture, and so on. So it's the attendees are also having a very wide background. So what I have decided to do is to provide a tutorial so that people who are not very familiar with the spin-based neuromorphic computing can have some basics. So basically my talk will be laying the platform for the other speakers to continue with their advanced topics. So I'll not be showing a catalog of all the work done in my group. I will let my students and postdocs present the work in our group as a contributor talks. If there is time, I will still touch on a few topics that we are working on. If at all I cover any work, they come from my students, postdocs, and collaborators from IMRI, Singapore, and Professor Sbia from Sultan Qaboos University, who will also be giving a talk after me. So basically, our team is working on spin-based neuromorphic computing, and we have been supported by the grants from A-STAR and NRF. So under the NRF CRP grant, we have a team of researchers with experience in physics, material science, and computer science background. So together, we are trying to achieve spin-based neuromorphic computing. So this is the outline of my talk. At first, I'll introduce the problem, and later I move on to spin-based neurons and the synapses. So these two topics, these first two bullets are where I'll spend most of my time. And if there is time, I'll touch upon the domain wall pinning, energy reduction for domain wall motion, and so on. As all of you know, about 30 years ago, we used to have various electronic gadgets for different purposes. Whereas currently we can satisfy all the needs with our mobile phone. So with our mobile phone, we can capture video, we can shoot photographs, we can play music, we can play games, and we can also talk. So many functions of electronic gadgets of 3 decades ago have been integrated into one smartphone in the recent few years. So this growth is mainly coming from the way the electronics industry grow following the Moore's law. So Moore predicted that the number of transistors in the electronic devices, chips will increase twofold every 1.5 years or so, and so on. And the electronics industry has been following this path for many years, but they have been facing problems because of the physical limits associated with the traditional scaling. So in this sense, the electronics industry is looking at new materials. That's where spintronics is coming. So that explains the spin-based neuromorphic computing part of my talk. Okay, so that's one part. Then this conference, as you know, is about artificial intelligence, which is we are trying to see how brain-inspired computing can help the artificial intelligence. And as you can see from here, the artificial intelligence technology had its own summers and winters. So, but in the recent few years, artificial intelligence has been growing. So you can also see from this chart that artificial intelligence has started way before 1950s. So it's also one of the technologies which is older than the internet. And as I mentioned, in the recent few years, there have been tremendous growth in the artificial intelligence, and it has been widely implemented as a consumer electronics application. So all the major electronics manufacturers, they have products where artificial intelligence is employed. But the major problem of artificial intelligence as of now is the power consumption. So all these applications consume a significant amount of power. So that needs to be taken into consideration when we look at artificial intelligence. So this problem of power consumption comes from the fact that we are using the von Neumann architecture, which is roughly 70 years old. So in the von Neumann architecture, we have a CPU at one part of the computer and memory unit separately at a distance away from the CPU. So if you take a desktop PC, maybe the memory unit is 4 centimeters away from a CPU. So if you compare that size, that distance of 4 centimeters with the size of a transistor, which is say about 40 nanometer, then that distance is equal to, in terms of human scale, if a human size is the size of a transistor, that distance is equal to a human traveling 1,000 kilometers. So it's a very large distance between the memory and the CPU. As a result, I mean, during the operation, any computation, that the data goes back and forth between the memory unit and the CPU. So this delays the computation, and this also increases the power consumption associated with computing. So this problem is called a von Neumann bottleneck, and this is what is faced by the artificial intelligence applications as of now. So as I mentioned, one of the major breakthrough for artificial intelligence came from the momentous instance where the Deep Blue, which is a supercomputer, which is capable of imagining an average of 200 million positions per second, beat a human. So that's where the interest for artificial intelligence grow. But if you compare the power consumed by the supercomputer the supercomputer consumes megawatts of power to do the calculations to beat the human, whereas the human brain, so in this case, Gary Kasparov, the power used by the brain is only 20 watts. So this indicates that our brain is a superior, more power efficient device compared to a supercomputer. Even if you compare the latest supercomputer by Fujitsu, which is Fugaku supercomputer, the supercomputer may be able to do more calculations per second. However, if you look at the power efficiency of a human brain compared to the supercomputer, the human brain is much more power efficient. You can see that the power efficiency of the human brain is 5 teraflops per watt, whereas the efficiency of the supercomputer is 0.014 teraflops per watt. So this clearly tells that the brain is more power efficient computing system. And if we can use if we can create a computing system based on the inspiration from brain, then we can achieve more power efficient systems, which will be helpful for the artificial intelligence in the near future. So that's where the neuromorphic computing or brain inspired computing is coming from. So unlike the artificial intelligence, where we use existing hardware, in the case of neuromorphic computing, we will try to develop new hardware elements, and we'll also have new algorithms and so on. So this is basically a brief introduction to the neuromorphic computing. So as I mentioned, this is based on the inspiration from brain. So if you look at the brain, there are two important components of brain associated with the computation power of brain. One is the neuron, and the other part is called synapse. So neuron is like the processor of a computer. So it receives input from many other neurons, and when it reaches a critical potential, it gives a spike, and the spike travels through the dendrite to other neurons. And you can also see that the neurons are connected by synapses. So these synapses form as a bridge between two neurons, and they serve as the memory in the case of brain. They store the information. Basically, in the case of synapse, the connection becomes stronger with learning. So this is basically the two important aspect of brain. And when we develop neuromorphic computing, basically we have to develop elements which represents neurons and synapses. So if you look at what should be the requirement of neuron and synapses in terms of an electrical perspective, then you will learn that the neurons should receive input from other neurons. So the pulses coming from other neurons will be like analog pulses, and it should produce a spike, which is like a digital pulse. So this is one requirement of neuron. And if you look at the requirement of synapse, as I mentioned, synapse store the weightage associated with learning. So in the case of electronics application, we talk about the change in the resistance as a weight. So you may call the high resistance as a low weight, or low resistance as a high weight, and so on. So basically, a synapse that we make in electronic form should exhibit multiple resistance states. So that has provided a basic introduction to the neuromorphic computing. Now we'll touch upon the spin-based neuromorphic computing. So again, as I mentioned, I'm talking to people who are not so familiar with the spintronics. So one of the key elements of spintronics, whether it's a magnetic random access memory or a hard disk sensor and so on. So the key device associated with the spintronics is the tunneling magnetic tunnel junction, which basically operates on the principle of tunneling magnetoresistance. So in this case, we have two ferromagnetic layers, as I show in this picture. So we have a cobalt iron boron, which is a ferromagnetic layer, and we have another cobalt iron boron, which are separated by a thin insulating layer, which is made up of magnesium oxide. So if the two layers have the same magnetization direction, then the electrons that flow through this device, magnetic tunnel junction device, will have a higher conductivity or lower resistance. And if they have anti-parallel resistance, then there is a lesser probability for electrons to tunnel from this side to the other side. As a result, this device will have high resistance. So this aspect of achieving high resistance and low resistance by having layers with the anti-parallel or parallel magnetization configuration is useful in sensing information in hard disk drive and in storing information in magnetic random access memory. So in this picture, I show that the magnetization direction of the individual layers in magnetic tunnel junction can be changed by a field. And this is what we use in the hard disk drive technology. Whereas in the case of magnetic random access memory, we can actually change the configuration of this device from parallel to anti-parallel or anti-parallel to parallel by sending current through the device. Sorry, okay. Let me move. So by making the layers to be parallel or anti-parallel, we can achieve 0 and 1 states. And this is what we call spin transfer torque magnetic random access memory. And this is what was covered by Vinayak in the morning. But the problem of the STT MRAM is that it can only store 2 states, 0 and 1, which is not suitable for neuromorphic computing. For example, if you want to make use of a Synapse based on MTJ, you want the magnetic tunnel junction to have multiple resistance states, which is not possible by the conventional STT MRAMs. So this is where one of the inventions by Professor Sbia, who will give a talk next, and myself come into use. So in 2010, we have been working on this design, and we published this paper in 2013. So in this case, we have a magnetic tunnel junction, which looks like a stripe. Instead of a cylindrical MRAM device, which is used in MRAM, cylindrical MTJ is used in MRAM. Here we are using a stripe-like magnetic tunnel junction. So in this magnetic tunnel junction, depending on the position of the domain wall, we can have different resistance states. So basically, this kind of device is perfect as a choice for making Synapse. So this is something that we published like 8 years ago, and this kind of devices can be used as Synapse. So, for example, if we have a domain wall device with which has a stripe-like shape, depending on their position, we may have a low resistance of say about 1000 ohms when the two layers are parallel, or when they have anti-parallel magnetization, they can have a highest resistance state, and depending on the intermediate positions, we can achieve intermediate resistances. So this is a perfect candidate for Synapse application. So we can change the position of the domain walls of the free layer of magnetic tunnel junction either by spin transfer torque or spin orbit torque. So recently, around 4 years ago, the group of Professor Kaushik Roy in Purdue University, they came up with a circuit for neuromorphic computing, which is entirely based on the domain wall device that I showed before. So they showed that if you can make synapses or neurons as shown in this picture, and you can even make a circuit, a neuromorphic computing circuit, which will look like this. So in this case, we have neurons here. All these at the bottom are neurons. So these are made up of domain wall-based magnetic tunnel junctions. And we can also create synapses based on the domain wall devices. So by making an array of domain wall MTJs in the form of array, we can make neuromorphic computing circuitry. So that is the foundation for the spin-based neuromorphic computing. So now I have about 10 minutes, so I'll briefly touch upon two aspects of neuromorphic computing based on domain wall devices. So the first aspect is domain wall pinning. So in this case, I show a domain wall device, which is based on cobalt palladium multilayers. So here what we do is we are trying to measure the Kerr microscopy of the domain wall device shown here. So here, for example, you may consider that white means the magnetization is up and gray means the magnetization is pointing down. So by changing the external magnetic field, you can magnetize the device to be having up direction or down direction. So in this experiment, we are sweeping the magnetic field, and you notice that we start with a very high positive field. And when we go towards negative field, until about minus 1854 posted, the magnetization has not switched. So in the starting point also, the magnetization is facing up. So it has white color, and until here, the domain has white color indicating magnetization is pointing up. So only when we change the magnetic field, just by about 4 Oersted, the magnetization flips completely. So you can see that there is no domain wall propagation. So in all my slides so far, I was showing that for synaptic application, we should be able to move the domain wall from one side to the other side. And here we don't see any such domain wall motion. So this indicates that we have to do something. So that aspect is what we call domain wall pinning. So here what happens is that when we apply, say, a field of minus 1858, the domain walls nucleate in this pad and they just propagate. So what we want to do is we want to stop the domain walls at certain positions so that we can achieve multi-level resistance in the magnetic tunnel junction. So we have carried out a few different experiments to achieve this controlled pinning in domain wall devices. I think Professor Sbia will also talk about this. So one of the earlier form of devices that we have made is a staggered domain wall devices. So in this case, we have a domain wall device which is not just linear. We have made kind of step kind of arrangement. So one region will be like this, and another region will be like this, and so on. So the domain wall device forms a kind of step, and the domain walls get stuck in these positions. Okay, so by making such devices and by applying external magnetic field, we have moved the domain walls. So this is one experiment that we have done. And in this case, the domain wall motion was carried out by magnetic field. But using magnetic field is an inefficient process for neuromorphic computing applications, because the whole objective of neuromorphic computing is to save energy. So if you are using a magnetic field, which is energy inefficient, then it defeats the whole purpose. But this is a good starting point for research. And later, we have also moved the domain walls in these devices by spin transfer torque, which is more energy efficient than the moving by magnetic field. And recently, we have also been working on a Meander wire synaptic device. So in this case, instead of having step like domain wall device, so instead of having a straight wire, we have a wire where the domain wall, the domains, individual segments of the magnetic tunnel junctions are offset from each other. So in this case, again, these corners where there is an offset will be able to pin the domain walls so that we can move the domains to be half up, half down, or a quarter up, 3/4 down, and so on. So this Meander wire synaptic device is something that we are working on. So in this case, the pinning strength depends on how far we offset each segment from each other. So here I show one result. We have offset the domains from each other by either 15% or 40% or 50%. 50% means two segments are offset from each other by a significantly large percentage. So the distance between two segments is half the width of the segment. So in this case, you will notice that when the displacement between the two segments of a meander wire is higher, the pinning is very efficient. You can see that the domain wall stops at these positions. So these results indicate that meander wire is a good technique to pin the domain wall. So by having such kind of pinning, you can see that the free layer magnetization is moving depending on the offset. So this is one good configuration for domain wall pinning. So this is something that we have been working on. And the second topic I'll be touching briefly is the energy reduction for domain wall motion. I'll not spend too much time because one of my students also will be talking about this aspect. So we just learned that we can move the domain wall by magnetic field or spin transfer torque. But for moving the domain wall, the most preferred form is a spin Hall effect, because that's more power efficient compared to the other two techniques which I described before. So in spin transfer torque, we have a heavy metal layer below a ferromagnetic layer. Let's say this is the free layer of the MTJ, and we have a heavy metal layer. And when we send current through the heavy metal layer, there will be spin polarization. So spin polarized current will go to the ferromagnetic layer and it will help to move the domain walls. So this is the most power efficient way of writing information in synaptic devices. So typically, people use a tungsten as the spin Hall layer, and this tungsten is usually sputtered at a high pressure. So this high sputtered tungsten is high pressure sputtered tungsten is considered as a material for spin Hall effect in the recent past. But one problem associated with the high pressure sputtered tungsten is that it will increase the resistivity and it will also increase the pinning field. As a result, we may lose more energy in Joule heating, as well as the energy associated with pinning of the domains in the tungsten due to the high pressure tungsten layer. So what we have proposed is instead of one high pressure tungsten layer, our design consists of two layers. So one layer is made up of high pressure tungsten and another layer is made up of low pressure tungsten. So when I say high pressure, which means when we deposit the tungsten in the sputtering chamber, the chamber has a high pressure of argon sputtering gas. So by having these two layers and by depositing ferromagnetic layer stack on top of this, we have achieved a more energy efficient spin Hall effect. I will not go through the details because my student will be presenting and my time also is running out. I'll just show a few results. Firstly, from the resistivity of the devices, we observed that our two-layer tungsten, which has 3 nanometer of high pressure tungsten and 3 nanometer of low pressure tungsten, is still in beta phase, and it has a reasonably good resistivity showing the beta phase. And when we try to move the domain wall in a reference sample, which is made up of tungsten deposited at high pressure, the domain wall motion was not easy. We need either high magnetic field or very high current to move the domain walls, and in most cases, the domain wall motion was abrupt. We couldn't control the domain wall motion easily. So basically, those results showed that the conventional high pressure tungsten is not very energy efficient. Whereas when we made devices based on a dual tungsten, we could move the domain wall with a very low current density. In some cases, it's even like 10⁻⁷ ampere per meter square. We could move the domain walls. So in this case, you notice that the current density we have used is 10⁻⁷ ampere per square meter, which is one of the very low current densities, but we could still move the domain walls. The domain wall velocity may not be very high. For example, to move from here to here, about 25 micrometer, we need 20 pulses, but we could still move. So this indicates that we could move domain walls with very low current density, which means very low energy. And this kind of slow motion, I mean, low velocity is still all right for neuromorphic computing, where in the case of Synapse, we are receiving input from many other neurons, and multiple inputs help to move the domain wall positions over certain time. And we have also carried out experimental results to find out the origin of such a low current density in this material. Okay, so to summarize my talk, I have introduced the basic concepts of neuromorphic computing, where we are using a magnetic tunnel junction, domain wall based magnetic tunnel junction as the synaptic element. And I have also showed that we can pin the domain wall positions in these domain wall devices by geometrical methods. So I showed you two different types. One is the staggered domain wall, and another one is the meander domain wall. And thirdly, we have also developed some new types of spin Hall material, where the energy reduction is significantly large. So we could move the domain walls by a distance of about 20 nanometer by using attojoule pulses. Okay, so with that summary, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prem. It's a good presentation. So now this talk is open for the questions and comments. Is there any question or comment?
If anyone has questions, please unmute your mic, ask your question.
If not, okay, is that I have a question. I think that you proposed that this kind of domain version by using the pulse is 10 years ago or something. First,
yes, yeah.
At that time, I feel that this kind of the technique is for the memory application.
Yeah, at that time it was not for neuromorphic application.
Yeah,
it was for memory application. Yes, it was for multi-level memory.
In that sense, is that for the memory application, many people is working on that. Is that domain wall motion by applying that spin transfer torque or something? Is there any difference for that? Is that how should I say? That some target of the research for that is the neuromorphic computing or memory application.
At that time, our aim was for memory application, multi-level memory. It was for multi-level memory.
Yes. My question is, I mean that, for example, is that, how should I say, any difference of the target between that is the memory application or neuromorphic computing application? How to operate the domain or
when we at that time we had plan of using spin transfer torque to move the domain wall, but that's not very power efficient. So currently we are using spin orbit torque, spin Hall effect to move the domain wall. So that's one difference. I think for multi-resistance state as a multi-level memory has some issues. I think if you want to achieve say 8 bits, then we need to have 2⁸ different domain wall position, which becomes very large. But but I think it's more suitable for a neuromorphic computing application than a multi-level memory applications.
Okay, thank you. Is that there is a question? Is that Professor Rao? Is that?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Fukuma. Prof. Prem, thank you very much for the very nice basic talk, and I was able to digest most of it. I think it serves a very good purpose. I have a simple question regarding that you were showing about the applying the current and making your domain wall move, and you should demonstrate it even at very low current densities of 10⁷ ampere per meter square. You are able to move it.
Yeah.
And you want to use this for application like Synapses, where you are saying that you are interested in achieving multiple resistive state.
Yeah.
How are you able to not only make the domain wall move forward but backward also? Can you control the direction of motion, and how do you do that? Or have you demonstrated that yet?
Yeah, so basically by changing the current direction, you should be able to move either forward or backward. In our particular device, we need to, okay, so if you look at my results before, we have used a very small external magnetic field of 1 millitesla. So we had a Hg field of 1 millitesla and we are sending current. So it was easy to move. I mean, with a very low current, we could move in one direction. If we have to move the domain wall in another direction, we have to apply a reverse field. Then we can still move with the same current. So just by changing the current direction, yes, we can move forward or backward.
Okay, so you have already achieved that.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then is the Professor?
I have one question.
Yes, please.
Professor Prate, thank you very much for the nice presentation.
Thank you.
Just regarding this low energy deposition of tungsten, so you showed us that by deposition with the low energy, you can achieve low resistivity, isn't it? That's what has been.
We are changing the power, the pressure.
Power.
Pressure.
Pressure. Sorry, the pressure.
Power. Yeah, pressure.
Okay, the pressure.
Yes.
So it is smoother, basically, no, something like that.
Yeah, ideally, if you deposit films at a high pressure, your films will be granular. It will not be smooth, and the low pressure usually gives a smoother film. So what people have observed is that at high pressure tungsten, they can observe very high spin Hall effect, but that's usually very high resistive case, right? So if you increase the pressure, you will have very granular film. The resistivity will keep increasing. So by having a low pressure tungsten, we can sort of optimize. I mean, our aim was to optimize the resistance, but we also saw other benefits like pinning field and so on, which will be discussed in detail by my student later. In my course later.
I mean, there is no correlation between the MI and the pressure.
We have not measured the DMI in detail yet.
Okay.
They are measuring the DMI.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
We have just a few minutes more. Is there any short questions? If not, yes, we can move to that next speaker. Thank you very much for the frame again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is the Professor Severe. Is the Professor Severe is?
Yeah, he's here.
He's here, yeah.
Yes.
Can you turn on the mic or camera?
Sorry, Professor Fukuma, it was mute. So I would like to share my slides with you. Can I access?
Now I can see your name. Is that not sharing that screen yet?
Saprit, can you enable him?
He is already enabled.
So I can share the slides with you?
Yes. Now I can see you. It's your camera.
So press the share screen. There's a green arrow at the bottom.
Okay, okay, good. Okay, that's the one I have. So I can go here and share.
Yes. then you can start that is
But I don't know, I have to join meeting. Is it normal?
No, you just you have to click the slideshow.
Okay.
Visible to us. They are visible, yeah.
We
It
can
is
see your
blocked.
slides.
You can see. Oh, okay. So I can just bring it here. Okay. Oh, sorry. So that's something like that. Maybe you can see it here better. Is it clear now?
No, we are seeing your Explorer. We are not seeing your screen. I mean, we are not seeing your slides, but we are seeing your Explorer.
Okay, hold on.
Explorer.
Oh, yes,
Okay.
yes. Now is the PPT is coming. Then you can start the slideshow. Please start the slideshow.
Okay.
Yes.
It's okay?
The screen looks very small,
Very small, yes.
but it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
I will try. Is better?
yeah, it's better, but okay, we can see. Thank you. Please start, Professor
Okay.
Spindle.
Thank you, Professor Fukuma. So I would like to thank the organizing of this conference. So actually, it's a good chance for me to present our work. So on neural computing with spin torque in multi-state magnetic nanowires. I am from Sultan Qaboos University in Oman. And I would like to thank my students and my collaborators, my students Bahri and Risi, and also Professor Prem and his team. And also to thank Professor, Kozel from KAUST in Saudi Arabia, and Professor Klaui from Mainz University. So this is the outline of my presentation. After a brief introduction about the current status of magnetic memory, and the challenges that is facing. So I will move to spin-based neuromorphic computing. Emphasize will be on neuron and synapses, because this is a very exciting topic, and still we need to learn more about, the neurons. Because we have some expertise in magnetic material and particularly in magnetic memory. So extended our work to domain, domain work. We start this work in 2009, and we come up with different schemes. So later on, we found it is interesting to use it for, neuromorphic computing. I will show you some schemes. Some of them, they have been covered by Professor Prem, and that's normal because we have been working closely together for many years. Then finally, I will describe how domain wall oscillation can be used for another, possible approach for future neuromorphic computing. Then I will summarize my talk. So, data storage is based on, the binary information 0 and 1. So you can store, the information either, this is the bit, you can have 0 and 1, and 2 to power 3, which is 8 bits, can give you a byte. So the memory application are very wide and keep increasing with time. So it covers different fields, starting from the computer, mobile phones, laptops, and now we can find memory in data centers, cloud computing. More recent years, we can see it in entertainment and smart TV, in robotic, medical applications, artificial intelligence. There are different, applications that you can find memory. So there is always a need for faster and much, high capacity memory. But as you know, this is a kind of history. If you look at the Intel 4004, which has been in the market in 1971. And now, this at the time you can have 2300, transistor, the size of 10 micron that you can see here, 10 micron transistor, and scaling down following Moore's law, which means that you can double the capacity every 1.5 years. So currently we can have 14 nanometer process. It's the smallest feature size that can be achieved by lithography. But if you look at this kind of increment, you go from 2,300 to 1.7 billion transistor. So that's huge improvement. I think Prof. Prem already covered some of this, and the scheme was very simple. You go just scaling down from 10 micron to 14. Now there are discussion on the feature step, which is about 7 to 5 nanometer feature size. There are lots of technological challenges that are facing scientists and engineers, and still people will ask even this will be achieved by different ways, but still what is beyond that? So until where we can go. So this von Neumann architecture will not be valid in the future, so we have to think beyond that. Okay, there is a need for new architecture, and neuromorphic computing is one of them. So this has been discussed nicely with Prof. Prem. So you can see in conventional von Neumann architecture, so the data, will go between the memory and the control units and the accumulator back and forth, and that's required high energy. Okay, the first step is to read the data, to do the computation, then write the result and come back to the memory. So that required very huge consumption of power and energy. It can go to megawatt per hour. Okay, megawatt hour basically. So this is the traditional von Neumann architecture. So what is next? So the next, we cannot, the Moore's law will definitely hit the wall sometimes, maybe next coming years. Now we can feel that achieving below 5 nanometers is almost, big challenge. I will not say it is impossible, but there are lots of problems ahead. So artificial intelligence is now widely used. You can see this in so many applications, starting from social media, like car navigation, for example. You can have a self-controlled car, self-driving car. In the entertainment, you can choose, depending on the person, you can have a recommendation, what you want to see in your TV. It can go also to the health sector, defense, security, like face recognition, banking, robotic. There are many enormous number of applications. Okay, then of course, neuromorphic, that's just, I think I can spend less time on this as has been discussed in the previous talk. Okay, so we need new architecture, which is different from von Neumann scheme. So this artificial intelligence has been kind of question that has been asked by Tunin long time back, has been published in this paper. He said, he questioned if the computer can think. That was the main question. And since then, there are lots of progress in the field. Okay, this is the neurons. You can see this is a presynaptic neuron. It is made mainly by the body here, the cell body. There is nucleus inside, and there is the axon. There are it's not well understood, but people until now they said this is just like a pad for electrical signal. But some other scientists they think it is more complicated than that. Okay, and there is the synapses, which is the junction between presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron. So those are dendrites, which are the connection between the terminal of axon and the next neuron. So we can think that about 100 billion nerve cells in the brain. Okay, basically some researchers, recent research, they said 86 billion. Okay, and those dendrites, they have 10 to power 4. 10,000 per neuron. So it's a large number. So the spike is transferred from one neuron to the other one through the axon, okay, via the synapses. So this is the connected neuron here. So you can see the information is going from one to the other one. Now the speed of information is still a puzzle. For example, the pain is transmitted at the, at speed of 0.5 meter per second to 2 meter per second with the narrow axon. However, for example, the touch, for example, the sense of the touch, that will be at very high speed, which is about 80 meter per second to 120 meter per second. So this is still the information from one neuron to the other one. It depends on different type of information. Okay. The major challenge for current memory is the power. For example, for the brain, it needs less than 100 watts to perform very, very complicated calculation or tasks. As I said earlier, each neuron has 10 to the power 4 dendrites. Okay. To understand more about the brain and its biology, the brain doesn't work with zeros and ones. It is not digital information. It's like spikes. Okay. And the response to the signal from another neuron, with analog signal. However, the output information is digital. Okay. So that I think has been covered. I will not spend too much time on this. So when it comes to the computing, there is neural network model. This is the inputs information that is coming, as I will show you later on in one scheme. So, and there is the synapse weight, which is this factor G here, the weight here, and it goes through the transfer function, and you can have the output. So this one is analog, and output is digital. Now for the weight here, or programmable resistive synapses here, you can see this one, this is like crossbar, which we know from traditional MRAM or any type of memory, you can have crossbar here. And this one is resistive kind of memory. It can be phase change, can be spin torque, can be also resistive RAM, because this one has a change of resistance by changing the current. And the neuron here, can be, we can use, for example, MTG or any kind of spin-based memory. This is free layer. You can see here the hard layer. And this is magnetic tunnel injection. So there are several models that we proposed, and I will show you only one of them, which really, I like it because it is very simple. There is no big change from what we used to see in MRAM. If you look at this part here, it looks like MRAM. And this one basically is the neuron output, the synapses. Okay. Now this crossbar, you have here resistive memory. Normally they are using resistive RAM like titanium oxide, or we call conductive bridge RAM, because this one, as you change the current, you change the resistive, the resistance gradually. And this one is the weightage, as I showed you in the previous slide here. This is the function G, which is basically metrics. Okay. Now from here, you can see here they are using in this scheme was published in 2009. This one is simple magnetic tunnel injection. That means you can switch the free layer back and forth, so you change the resistance. More recently, I saw some papers talking about domain wall memory here in the synapse. So this is can change. Even some people, they propose spin torque oscillator, okay, instead of MTG. So I will discuss briefly. This is a simple magnetic information about MTG transfer. MTG, I choose this scheme, which is very simple. You have here, two ferromantic layers separated by an insulator. Okay, basically MGO. Okay, now one is hard and one is soft. For example, the top one, if free layer, top one ferromagnetic layer 1. This one is the hard layer. It doesn't change by applying magnetic field or a spin polarized current. However, the bottom one, which is the free layer, it can change direction. So this one, in this scheme from left side, the majority of electrons can tunnel without much scattering, and the minority will be scattered in this layer and the second one. So this will lead to low resistance. On the other hand, when you have the two magnetic layer having direction opposite to each other, then both of them will be scattered either in one or in the other. So that will lead to the high resistance. So we can have low resistance and high resistance. Now you can change the free layer direction, which is in this case the bottom one, by either applying magnetic field or spin torque, or even others like spin acoustic wave, for example, or Hall effect, for example, spin orbit coupling. So there are different ways that you can use to switch the magnetization of the free layer. Now this is the spin torque effect. So in simple description, you have the hard layer. So this will not change. It is magnetically hard. So when you have the electron, going through this this device, so they will be polarized by the hard layer. Then there is transfer of the momentum. Now in this case, if we assume the free layer is pointing opposite to the hard layer, then the transfer of momentum from the electrons up majority will force the free layer to reverse, to switch the direction. Okay, that's so you can create low resistance. If this one is actually pointing, sorry, I think there is some animation didn't work. Now, if this one is parallel to the hard layer, now in this case, required higher current. And the reason for that, because in this you have to rely on the minority electrons, which will be scattered through the interface. So if you look at the hysteresis, the switching of the magnetization versus the current, you will find there is a large asymmetry in the hysteresis, because it is a very switched magnetization when it is against the hard layer, and you require higher current to switch it back to the opposite direction. So that's basically two important information about tunneling junction and transfer torque. Okay. Now, materials selection for neuromorphic computing. So there are some requirements. So as I showed you earlier when I described the neurons, so you have multi-state, depends on the number of synapses, which is the interface between two neurons. There is a need for low power, okay, and it has to be non-volatile. That means once the information is stored, that means state stabilized, it has to remain for a certain time.
Maybe his internet connection is not
His
okay.
internet connection, yeah.
Yeah. Let's wait for a while. Good morning, Johan.
There was interruption, isn't it?
Yeah. Your internet connection had a problem, I think.
Okay.
Maybe you should share your screen again.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay.
Please share the presentation.
Okay, which slide?
Separate, maybe you need to enable him.
He's already enabled.
Okay.
You can see me, right?
Yeah, we can
Yes,
see.
we can see.
I stopped here, isn't it?
No, we cannot see your screen yet.
You cannot see the screen?
No.
Okay. I have to share that's what. Is it okay?
Yeah, now it's better. Still better than before.
Okay. So
Also, you can turn off your video.
Use the slideshow rather than.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is clear now?
Maybe you go to the display settings at the top.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe swap or duplicate. Yeah.
So
okay.
I stopped here. The interruption was here.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will go to requirements. I hope there will be no interruption again. I'm sorry for that. So this is the candidates. I mean, the 4 type of materials that has been selected so far for neuromorphic computing. STT RAM, that's mean basically is tunnel injunction. The PC RAM, phase change material, which basically by injecting the current, you can change the material from crystalline to amorphous state progressively, which leads to a change of resistance. So change of resistance means you have multi-state devices. The other one, which is also very popular, is resistive RAM, which is based on metal oxide, and you can have some oxygen vacancies that will go to the other electrode, and accumulation of these oxygen vacancies will lead also to a progressive change of resistance. The last one is almost similar to resistive RAM, which is a conductive bridge. Here you have metal which connect between bottom electrode and top electrode, and you keep accumulating the metal here, and of course that will also lead to a change of resistance. Now, if I summarize here the advantages or the characteristics, I would say, for each type of those 4 materials, I look at carefully at the right cycle. I collected this information from the latest papers. So I look at the right cycle, the energy, writing energy, the time, the writing and reading times, and retention. So the retention, I mean, all of them almost similar except the write cycle. Now we can argue here those values might change with time because there is always daily work on improving the material. But all you can see the write and read time in the range of a few nanoseconds, which is good. You can see that for STT RAM is 0.1 picojoule, and this based on spin torque in addition to spin Hall effect or spin orbit coupling. So we might not be surprised to have even lower than that in the future. As Professor Prem just showed earlier, that if you are using a different type of material as seed layer, you still can improve drastically the writing energy. I mean, the current needed to move domain wall, for example. But the difference you can see here is the write cycle. So STT-RAM almost infinite number of cycles. That means you can write many times, 10 to the power 15, maybe even more. But for others, because of their nature, because they are material that has to change from one phase to the other one, crystalline to amorphous, or to have conduction of metal through the junction, that will lead to the fatigue of the material, and the performance will go down. So that's the major problem for these 3 categories. Otherwise, I could see that most of them are similar. Retention is high for all of them. That means they are non-volatile. Okay, so we have been working for a long time on magnetic material and spin transfer torque effects. So that's my presentation will be basically on, spin-based memory or neuromorphic computing. So the switching from one state to the other in tunnel injunction is basically stochastic switching in nature, and this is intrinsic to the magnetic switching. Of course, it can worsen if you add any defect coming from the process or from the material deposition. But even it is perfect deposition, it is very nice lithography process, you still will have certain stochastic, randomness in the switch. There's some probability. Okay. Now this scheme has been discussed by Professor Prem earlier. I will just emphasize this is some work that we have been doing. Maybe 2010 we started using simulation, and we thought at that time for using multi-level memory, which now can be used for neuromorphic computing. It is basically composed of tunneling junction here in shape of wire, and you have a small portion on the top, which is this one. You can see it is GMR devices. Why we choose GMR here? Because we don't want the signal coming from GMR to affect the reading signal coming from the junction. So for MTG, the signal is much higher than GMR. GMR maybe 5% in the best case. However, for MTG, the signal, the magnetic junction signal can be over 100%. So this will not affect the readback signal. However, it will be very efficient for switching the magnetization in this very small region. And once it is done, you can push the domain to different positions. Now you have 3 electrode devices. We use these 2, the bottom one and this one, for writing information and for pushing the domain wall to different position. And we use this one from the right side and the bottom for reading the information. So you need this area to be as small as possible. And of course, this one also. So that's the scheme we proposed, and we did some simulation. And you could see here in this scheme, this is the region in yellow, which is in contact with GMR. So we can create a domain wall here by single pulse with 6 milliampere, quite high. Then second pulse, we'll move domain at different positions. What is interesting here, if we can reverse the direction of the current in the second pulse, we can still bring back the domain wall to the other position. So you can still go back and forth to define the magnetic state. It is good for having multi-level, but the challenge and problem here, the major problem, is the stability. So we are not sure if the domain wall will stay here for some time. Maybe after a few seconds, it might move to different position. And this means the state is lost. Now we forgot this work for some time, and later on we said, okay, let's just confirmation of what I said here. Okay, this is basically we did some we fabricated some nanowires, and we could see here if you apply magnetic field, it is almost difficult to stabilize or to pin domain at any position. We try different times. Either you go from up to down or reverse, so you cannot stabilize. But this device is not based on the one I showed you earlier, because we don't have tunneling junction. This is just a normal single layer. Okay, so to stabilize domain wall was big concern, and BICS and co-workers in 2007 they proposed which is now known as notches nanowire. So you create kind of notches here with different angles. They carry out a very nice study, very deep study, and they found there are different type of domain wall. For example, you can have this transverse type, symmetric transverse type. You can have this kind of asymmetric tilted type, and you can have also this asymmetric buckled type. So depending on the size, the angle. But the interesting things is you can stabilize the domain. We believe if we go in the future to 10 nanometer here, the width of the nanowire, and if we are aiming to get notches with 5 nanometers, that will be challenging, and the stability depends drastically on this WC. So you have to be perfect in the process. It is good if you are using 100 nanometer, maybe 50 nanometer, but if you go to 10 nanometers, the uniformity of the process will be a major problem, and the pinning will change from one device to the other. and thinking, okay, this is another confirmation. So this group from Noah and the co-workers, they use it for multi-levels. So they use normal notches and they use anti-notches. And nicely, you can see that they can stabilize domain wall at different positions. So it works perfectly. And as I said, this is 2 micron. So basically, this one will be around 1 micron. You can, I believe you can go down to 50 nanometers. But if you want to go below this, notches has to be non-uniform. Professor Prem, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, see, connection is okay. Yes, I'm happy to hear that. Okay, so thinking about that, we said, okay, since we are going for 10 nanometer in the future or 20, is there any way that we can create kind of nanoconstriction in easy way? And I believe if we can have 2 nanowires, and from the system, which is electron beam lithography high resolution, we can make very small offset in X and Y, which system can do it even with precision of 2 to 5 nanometers nicely. I think this we can fabricate such kind of devices. So this can be done much easier, and this can be even 5 nanometers, I believe, because the system now can allow us to have this offset. Once it is done on at the resist level, we can do etching, and you come up with very single device. So this is the simulation data we did in 2016. And we could see by changing the shape of the nanowire, we can, under certain conditions, we can stabilize, the domain here. So you can see if D is 20 or 15, the domain wall field, there is some kind of constriction, but suddenly it will just, the barrier energy is not high enough, so it will escape to the other edge from here to the other side. But if you make D quite strong, 25 in this case, I don't remember this one, maybe it was 14 nanometers with it. So you can still stabilize, and vice versa. Now here you fix D and you change also L. Now the opposite, you have to make here L smaller. You can see as you go for smaller L, you stabilize domain. So this has been done, and we spend maybe 1 or 2 years to make the real devices. I will just repeat what Prof. Prem explained to you. So this was collaboration work we did together. So we started first with just simple permalloy in plane material, which has been published in Physical Review Applied. We created randomly 8 uniformly separated constrictions, and we did D50 and L50, and just we found, we ran the experiment using different magnetic field in the plane of the nanowire, and we could nicely stabilize the domain wall at given constriction. Here you can see number 8, for some reason, it was not possible for this material. Maybe we had to work out more on, maybe we have to use pulsed field or something. Okay. Confirmation of domain wall here. You can see at step 1 or step 2. In all of them, we can see nice domain wall created. This is MFM images. Okay. Furthermore, we found that the pinning, this is deep pinning. That means the field needed to move domain wall from this area, so it is gradually increasing. Depending on the lambda, depending on D, and of course, if you want to go from one step to the other, you can adjust the right pinning. So it is a controllable way of stabilizing or pinning domain wall, and also to release it from the junction. So both are important. So this is important data. It shows that you can stabilize the domain wall here for, I think, if we extrapolate this one, using Sharrock's law, plotting this in logarithmic scale, it will give us expectation of time of stability depending drastically on lambda and D, these 2 parameters. We can achieve more than 1 year, and that was confirmed because we created domain wall at certain devices, and we left them for a few months. And I asked my students to go back to MFM and take picture, and we saw that still the domain at the same junction. So there is very easy way to fine-tune the stability factor. Okay, so this has been done. And after we decided, was done using magnetic field. Then later on, we made spin torque based devices. And for this case, we have to select the right material because we had a choice between cobalt platinum and cobalt nickel multi-layers. We found out that it is easy to control the domain size, as you can see here, by changing the number of bilayers. So we varied the number of bilayers from 6 to 12. And you can see the pictures here. So this is 6. It looks, this one has the smallest domain size. So we expect a smaller domain wall inside. So we had two devices. You can see this is the blue one, cobalt platinum 12, cobalt nickel 12. Almost they have the same domain size, but the anisotropy, it looks for cobalt platinum is much higher than cobalt nickel. Okay, now this is the result. We started first with applying magnetic field, in this case perpendicular to the nanowire. What surprised us is we can create domain stability at the steps area. You can see it here, but randomly. There is some randomness of the position. You repeat the experiment again, you found domain wall is moving to another. So there is no controllability of that. So the advantage here is you can pin at constriction, but however, the randomness has been seen. So then we decided to move to spin torque. So this is the result. So I will summarize in this slide. So you can see here that by applying current between the two electrodes, we created, we call this nucleation pad to create a magnetic domain at lower magnetic field to stabilize it here. Then after we applied low power, pulsed current. We use a large pulse width, 100 microsecond, and we varied the amplitude. As you can see here, both has been varied. Sometimes in this case, we can use, we use 200 microsecond. So we have been able to position domain wall at different steps, and almost we can move a different position except for the state 5, which somehow has been missing. But I don't think this is an issue because we could position state 5 if, I believe, if we could reduce the pulse width. But we are using, we have been using a setup that has not a small pulse width. So that means this is promising data. That means we can move domain wall at a given position by changing the pulse width and okay. This is basically what has been achieved so far. Now this is data shows the deep pinning field. That means once the domain is pinned here, we need to move it to the next step. So here is deep pinning field in milliampere as function of the applied perpendicular. Okay, we selected here two different geometries, the 200, 600, and lambda 0 and 100. And you can see as the field is increasing, of course, the deepening current is getting smaller. So the same trend for two cases, I mean for 600, 100, and for 200, 0. Okay. This is the time because that gives us indication of the stability of domain wall. So again, we found this nice exponential decay of the stability, the retention time as function of the field. And if we convert this one to logarithm using Sharrock's law, this formula here, that we found it is almost linearly dependent on this factor. Okay, by extrapolating this one to 0, we could get the stability factor. That means the time of retention, which again, very promising, is about maybe 2 to 3 years. You can make it less, you can make it more higher by adjusting those two key parameter lambda, and which basically it is expected that if you make D larger, then you can pin domain for longer time. But the price to pay for that is to deepen this domain wall, you need higher current. So you need to compromise between stability and the power consumption, which is the current. Okay, this is I will switch to the same topic, but another scheme. I showed you earlier we can use MTG in the Synapse. Here I show you that we can use the nano wires, but there is also possibility to use spin torque. This is very nice work. How much do I have?
Oh, time is over already.
Okay, okay. I will conclude in maybe 2-3 minutes.
Yes, please.
Okay? So by doing this study, we could found that under certain condition, not only you can stabilize domain wall in the junction, but still you can oscillate. And that was surprising for us, but this was observed under very critical conditions. So this is how it looks like if we zoom in the junction area. So we can see this oscillation is really with certain frequency. Now, this graph shows that we have three kind of stages or conditions. Depending on the applied current, you can have damped oscillation, you can have uniform oscillation, and you can have complete movement to the edge. So you can turn the frequency nicely. Okay, here you can see the amplitude is fixed, and this is the frequency. It can go to different values, and we propose this to be used for synapses in the future, because this is not digital. The neurons have information that are not digital. They are like spikes. Okay, so this is our device we will work on in the future. We can inject current from T1 to T2. This is to move domain, domain wall. And here from T1 to terminal 1 to 3, you can sense the oscillations. So I believe this scheme also for domain wall oscillation can be used in the future. So I will just summarize my talk. So we talk about the basic concept of neuromorphic computing. I discussed briefly multi-state domain wall for synapses. Emphasis was done on the pinning and stability. Multi-level has been achieved, and I believe in the future that nano oscillator using domain wall could be also another options that has to be explored in the future for neuromorphic computing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the good presentation, Professor Spear. So is there any questions or comment? Okay, if not, is that we should move to the next speaker. Time is over. Thank you very much.
You are welcome. Thank you.
So is the next speaker is Professor Johan Akama. Can you share your screen, please?
Yes, just a moment here. Does that work?
Yes. Thank you. Please start.
Great. Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to talk to you. When I got this invitation, I was looking forward to a very warm, nice Singapore. Right now we have -14 degrees in Stockholm, where I am currently. But it's okay. Let's talk about some mutual synchronization of spin-Hall nano oscillators and how we have now added Memristors to this to use for neuromorphic computing and spintronic icing machines. I want to highlight our collaboration with Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan. So very grateful to Shunsuke Fukami, Shun Kanai, and Hideo Ono for access to the very best material stacks for the devices I will show. All the fabrication was done and characterization was done in our group, and some simulation was done by Jakub Ciesinski at the AGH University of Science and Technology in Krakow, Poland, who I also want to thank. Let's see. So I will give an introduction to the device that we work with, the spin-Hall nano oscillator, the constriction-based spin-Hall nano oscillator. Then I will discuss mutual synchronization of them in chains and also in two-dimensional arrays. In these arrays, you want to ideally be able to control individual oscillators. And that we showed last year, how we can use voltage to control individual oscillators, and I will briefly mention and discuss that. And all of this is the background to what we've done most recently, where we have included memristors. So we get a conducting bridge in an insulator, and we can use this to switch between two different modes of operations. And also in one of those modes, we can tune the resistance of the memristor and add or subtract current. And that's a paper that just came out. And then towards the end, I will discuss a preprint where we have shown the first basic building blocks of spin-Hall nano oscillator-based icing machines. So with that, I'd like to just very early start here with the fundamental effect that is driving everything in spin-Hall nano oscillators, and that's the spin-Hall effect. It is an effect that you will find strongly in heavy metal films, such as platinum, tantalum, tungsten, and we use all these three materials. If you have just an electron current, a charge current through this metal, there is spin-dependent scattering, such that there will be a spin imbalance built up at the two interfaces. And if you put now a ferromagnetic metal on top or at the bottom of this layer, it doesn't matter, all of this, then you have to change the sign of the field. But you can have a ferromagnet on top, for example. Then this spin imbalance will transfer into it will be a spin current into the ferromagnet, and the ferromagnet will absorb the spin current. And depending on orientations of the spin polarization and the magnetization of the ferromagnet, you can get anti-damping torque. And that is the mechanism that we use. Anti-damping torque means that the natural damping of all magnetic movement, or all magnetodynamics in that ferromagnet, can now be canceled. And once that damping has been canceled, the ferromagnetic magnetization is free to auto-oscillate. That's what happens in a spin-Hall nano oscillator. And there are, let's see, I thought I could move. Yes. So, and that is what happens in a wide range of different geometries in spin-Hall nano oscillators. So here I will just very briefly mention the first such geometries were nano pillars and nano gaps. Nano pillars were done in magnetic tunnel junctions. So there was a tantalum underlayer here, and there are three layers: a free magnetic layer, then a tunnel junction, and then a reference fixed layer. And they were able to show that they could switch and they could get small magnetodynamics excited by a current through this heavy metal layer. More dedicated metallic devices were the nano gap spin-Hall nano oscillators. So an extended disk of permalloy and platinum, so a bilayer, and then gold needles coming into a gap that will focus the current, and that produces inside that gap sufficient current density and spin current densities to set up auto oscillations of the ferromagnetic material or its magnetization. And then nano constrictions and nano wires are more recent, and I will focus on the nano constriction ones because they have a lot of good things going for them. They are very easy to fabricate. You first deposit a bilayer, then you do need e-beam lithography to pattern that, but you can pattern it into nanoconstriction in one step. And then you use optical lithography to just connect to this device. And thanks to its open geometry like this, you have direct optical access. So you can use optical techniques to look at the spin wave dynamics in that region. That is not true for the pillars, but it is also true for the nanogaps and nanowires. But in the nanoconstriction, you can have simultaneous readout and electrical and optical readout of emanator dynamics. This was shown beautifully by Demidov, Rushdin, and Demokritov in 2014, and we quite rapidly then started to look into this because we felt this was a very, very useful device that we could benefit from. Now, as a part of the motivation, so this is the basic device that we will use. Why are we interested in spin-Hall nano oscillators? Well, it was mentioned briefly at the end of the previous speaker's talk that nano oscillators can be used for neuromorphic computing. There are commercial oscillator-based computing devices out there. And the most famous one is D-Wave's quantum annealer Ising machine. So they have interacting Josephson junctions, which can be in different states or binary states. And if you control the coupling between those, you can make this network do a computation for you. And it has been shown that instead of Josephson junctions operating at 15 millikelvin, you can have ordinary oscillators in a network doing the same type of computations. You can build an Ising machine with oscillator networks. And what we are interested in, can we now make this with nano oscillators? Because you would like to have thousands of oscillators connected in a network to solve really complicated combinatorial optimization problems. So to have multiple oscillators, we can either make them in chains or in arrays. And the most important thing is that they will interact. And the type of interaction you can measure, and you can prove that they interact, and you can determine or estimate how strongly they interact through mutual synchronization. So here is an example of a double nanoconstriction. So the lighter gray here is the metal part, and the darker gray is just the etched away material. That's the silicon substrate. And we will pass a current through here. And in this case, the two oscillators are separated by 300 nanometers. And you can see that at first we see two individual microwave signals here. Then they start to interact. This is a more blurry region. You can see two things happening. First, the frequencies are approaching each other. That's the frequency pulling from them, the mutual frequency pulling. They are already starting to interact here. And also the signal quality deteriorates. They are perturbing each other. So the line width broadens. They are no longer freely running on their intrinsic frequency. They are perturbed and trying to approach each other. So one can say that maybe at this point here, they start to interact, and the interaction grows stronger and stronger. And so at some point, they will just merge together and completely synchronize. And a number of things happen at that point. First, of course, they are now exactly on the same frequency, and then they are also at a much higher output power level. And if you look at the line width, it has also improved substantially. But for future, maybe it's a good thing to point out already here that this completely mutually synchronized state is actually not what we want to use for computation. This is an excellent state if you want to use these oscillators for signal generation. Then you want to have this very strong, robust, complete mutual synchronization. But from a computation point of view, this is a dead array. This array is not as good it's not a good example for computation. It's when you have this intermediate level of interaction where you will have the possibility for efficient Ising machines, just to point that out. We have then made longer chains. So this is an example of 9 such chains, and what you see at this is an SEM image of that. Again, now the dark black here is the SHNO. This is the device, and the lighter gray is the background and the substrate. And here you will see the electrical measurement, how the individual oscillators merge together. Some of them you can see their individual traces. Some of them are too weak or potentially already synchronized pairwise here. And then as we increase the current, more and more join, and just the signal coherency and the power goes up tremendously. This is actually a 50-time increase in power from this level here to this level here. And also using a spin wave microscope, a Brillouin light scattering microscope, one can look at the spatial map of spin wave intensity, and one can then see that they are all energized and they are all operating at the same frequency. We've done this also in two-dimensional arrays. If you want to have larger chains, you can do that. We made up to 50 oscillator in a chain. But to really get very large arrays, you would like to, or large collections, ensembles of oscillators, you would like to go into two-dimensional arrays. And here's one such example. We have 4 constrictions. So we have 4 oscillators, and we have made 4 different types, 4 different geometries of them. The size here is W, that's the width of the oscillator, and the P stands for pitch, that's a separation between them. So we go from 300 nanometer separation to 100 nanometer separation. And when you put them closer together, they will interact more strongly. In all these measurements of the power spectral density, you can see that they are mutually synchronized at the higher current levels. But at the largest separation, you can also see the individual signals first. So they mutually synchronize slightly later, whereas if you go to the more closely spaced, they are fully synchronized earlier. We can move to 16 oscillators. Then things change a little bit. So at the largest separation here, we will now see 4 distinct signals. And those actually come from the chains. One can show that the oscillators interact more strongly within chains than between chains. So what you see here are 4 chains that are synchronized within the chain, but not between chains. If we put the chains closer to each other, 200 nanometer apart, then also the chains synchronize with each other. And if we put them even closer, they start out in a synchronized state. We can push this to higher and higher, to larger and larger number of oscillators, and in principle, the same type of behavior continues. So at 5x5 arrays, we again need to be at 200 nanometers for them to be fully synchronized. At 6x6, we have to be more closely together. Same at 8x8, they are not fully synchronized here, but they are fully synchronized here. And in 10x10 arrays, we were not able to get them fully synchronized. And this is a bit of a statistical game. The interaction between oscillators are nearest neighbor. When we grow them, when we grow the array up to 100, it is more and more likely that groups will separate into partially synchronized states. So you might have 2 or 3 domains in this array that prefer to stay on the same frequency. And this becomes more and more likely the larger the array. You can show this through also statistical mechanics of that you can have a phase transition between in a 2-dimensional array of nearest neighbors interacting spins, if you like. And depending on the coupling strength, you will have a phase transition between completely ordered to domains of different sizes. And so this is reflected also here. Now, all these arrays were driven by a single drive current. So ideally, they are identical, because if you want to use them for signal generation, you want to have them as synchronized as possible. For that, you would like them to be as identical as possible. But in a computation situation, you would like to be able to control individual oscillators. So you can, because you will map the problem you want to solve, you will map onto this array by modifying either the oscillators or their coupling strength. And we did a study on this where we added a voltage gate to spin-Hall nano oscillators last year. The stack was now based on cobalt iron boron. If you grow a thin layer of cobalt iron boron on top of tungsten and you cap it with MgO, you will get substantial perpendicular magnetic anisotropy in the cobalt iron boron. If you make the cobalt iron boron thin enough, you will be able to switch the magnetization out of plane. 1.7 nanometers is a little too thick for that to happen. If we would have gone to 1.4 or 1 nanometer, it would definitely be out of plane very strongly, but 1.2 is still in plane. And I will come to why this is interesting to work at that boundary. What we saw in this device is that we had done a prior study where we were able to show that if you're out of plane, you can generate propagating spin waves with this constriction, because if you're in plane, you will have a localized mode. What we were able to show here was by controlling the gate voltage, we could change the frequency some 40-50 megahertz. And more surprising to us, we could change the threshold current. So the current we needed through the device to generate auto oscillations depended quite strongly on the gate. This is a 20% change, and it was unexpected to us. It is a combination of a change in the perpendicular magnetic anisotropy and the fact that we're operating close to this boundary between propagating spin waves and localized spin waves. Because if you do STFMR measurements, those are the ones to the left here, you can extract the damping of the device. And those are the blue data points here. You can see that the effective damping changes some 40-50% when we change the gate voltage here. And in simulations, we can reproduce this, and we can see that the type of spin wave mode that we have is really on the cusp between localized and propagating. So if we're operating at a positive voltage, the mode is localized. That means that it doesn't interact very strongly with the extended film. It's also not propagating in the spin waves. So it is not loaded as much. It doesn't feel as much dissipation when it is localized. And therefore, it's easier to get it started. And the effective damping, if you do an STFMR measurement, will be lower. But if you change the PMA such that you raise the frequency of the interior of the constriction here, that makes it more easy to get the mode to expand out into the extended film. And the larger this mode volume, the more dissipation you will have. You can also get to a situation where you actually propagate spin waves out, and then you also lose energy that way. So the end result is that the damping is 40% higher for this mode than it is for the more localized mode. And that's a giant change in the damping that you would never expect just from a material property. It's the combination of the change of the frequency and the geometry of the device. So this serves as a background to what we've done most recently. We can do voltage control oscillators, but we need to apply that voltage all the time. If you think of a large array, you now need as many voltages supplied simultaneously as you have oscillators. That's not a particularly practical situation. Instead, you would like to be able to store this behavior in a non-volatile way at each oscillator. And this is what we have done most recently. So what I showed you before was this pure voltage, pure E-field control of the operation. But this stack here can work as a Memristor also. When we are in this pure voltage regime, the Memristor is operating in its high resistance state. But you can make it operate also in a low resistance state. You can switch the Memristor, you can build up a conducting bridge in that insulator. And once that bridge is set up, you can now add or subtract current through the gate. So instead of what we had shown before was that we have a constant drive current and we can change the magnetic properties of the cobalt iron boron layer through the voltage. But in this low resistance state, we have a constant drive in the spin-hole nano oscillator, but then we can add or subtract additional current through this gate. So it's a different control mechanism, and it's also a programmable control mechanism because we can change we can change the resistance in this low resistance state such that the voltage we apply will be multiplied by the conductivity of this dielectric, and that will determine the extra current that we add. And that's another layer of functionality. This multiplication can then is now a part of the device. So first we want to characterize this memristor, and for that we make an IV curve. The state here is the high resistance state. It's about a gigaohm. It's from 100 megaohms to a gigaohm, and it stays that way until you get a voltage that is higher than the programming voltage of the memristor. So let's say we follow this green curve here. At some voltage, it switches up to a much lower resistance state. And we have limited the current. So we use a current compliance of 100 microamps. So it stops here. That's the maximum current that our supply will allow. And that determines how much this conducting bridge can grow. If we then reduce the voltage again, we will come to a linear region, which is the resistance of this device. So we have a resistance of 15 kilo ohms given by the linear slope here. And then at some negative voltage, it switches back to its high resistance state. If we now pick a different compliance, let's say we take the blue data curve for 50 microamps, we again follow here and we program the device. Now it will jump, the current compliance sets in earlier, so it will grow less. And you will see that when you go back in voltage, because now the resistance here is 22 kilo ohms and not 15. And then it resets again. And this continues. If we do this at a much lower compliance, we will get a resistance of 43 kilo ohms. So you have a non-volatile analog memory that you can control arbitrarily depending on how much you allow this conducting bridge to grow. How does that now affect the operation of the Spindle Nano oscillator? So in the inset here, you see the device. This is the Spindle Nano oscillator, and this is the gate with the memristor. At the bottom here, you will see the memristor voltage and the memristor current. We are using a current compliance of 100 microamps in this case. The operation of the oscillator here at 8 gigahertz is first controlled by the voltage controlled magnetic anisotropy. And then when the memristor switches, you get a higher frequency in a step-like manner because you add now 100 microamps through the gate. The oscillator is operating at 1.27 milliamps from the SHNO drive, and now we're adding 0.1 milliamp through the gate. Then we do a reverse sweep. We get into this linear region. It means that we're reducing this additional current from 100 microamps to actually a bit of negative current. And we have this linear slope here, after which it resets. We no longer have any negative current from the memristor. Instead, this is a field-controlled operation. So we have now this way of changing the frequency in a non-volatile way, depending on from the resistance of the device. And we can also use this in arrays. So here's the simplest such array, and I will show one example. So we have two oscillators. First, we look at their free running properties. So we let the memristors be floating. And then we just drive this SHNO current through them. And what we see are, at least here, we see a well-defined mutually synchronized high power state. And then they start to maybe break up, and they start to fight over different modes here. But this is a well-behaved operating point that we will pick. If we now add or subtract current through the memristor, we expect to go up and down in frequency, and we expect to also move into different regimes where the operation will be less synchronized. So first, we just check the Memristor 1 is behaving as we're expecting it to. It looks like it has the correct Memristor behavior. And then we look at the forward sweep. So now at a large negative voltage, the mutually synchronized state is broken up into two signals. When we go back to 0 volt, we regain this mutually synchronized state, and it stays like that until the Memristor switches, and then we get to a higher operating frequency, and we get into a state here where they are not as well synchronized, not as robustly synchronized anymore. So there's some mode jumping going on, which reflects what would happen if we move along in this direction. If we now reset it, we stay in this state. And when we get inside the linear region, we will have a linear control of this mutually synchronized state. And then when the device switches back, we get into this field, pure field operated state. So we can have memristors also control individual and pairwise oscillators in arrays. So before my time is up, this just shows how the line width and the power improves in the synchronized state. I want to talk a little bit about our work on spin-Hall nano oscillator icing machines. Again, our inspiration is the icing machine done by D-Wave, for example. It works great. It has now the most advanced one, which is this one, has some 5,000 Josephson junctions in a network. They can solve bigger and bigger icing machine problems or combinatorial optimization problems. But it has some drawbacks. It operates at 15 millikelvin. It draws some 25 kilowatts, and it's a very big machine. We would like to make this, we would like to make an alternative at room temperature and something that you could have in an ordinary computer, for example. So let's take the first baby steps towards that. So we'll start with our two-dimensional array that I described before. We'll operate it in a synchronized or almost synchronized state. We have 4 oscillators here. They have coupling strengths between them. And in our first demonstration here, we will not modify the coupling strength, but we will modify the operating conditions such that these coupling strengths change. First, we need to do something that makes something that's called phase binarization. And I will explain it this way. If we injection lock this array, which means that we inject a signal that is close to their intrinsic signal, we will force the array to be exactly in phase with the injected signal. So the array might be fully synchronized internally before we do this, but when we enforce an external signal, we will definitely make them completely synchronized, because we will force them to stay on this F1 frequency. The more interesting case, and the case that is needed for an icing machine, is when you inject twice that frequency. Because if you now look in the reference frame of the fundamental frequency, you have 2 generate states. Each oscillator can decide to be either at 0 phase or at pi phase, 180-degree phase, with respect to each other. So, because if they want to follow this injection, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's at 0 or pi with respect to the fundamental frequency phase. In other words, the coupling strengths, if they now have both positive and negative sign, it will be energetically favorable for this array to sometimes be for the oscillators to sometimes be anti-parallel or be parallel, depending on this coupling. And this is how you program an icing machine. You will define the problem through the coupling strengths, and then you will read out the phase of the array after some annealing has been done, and that is the solution to the problem. So we have started to investigate this. So we start with the simplest possible array we can think of. We take two oscillators that are here connected in parallel. They happen to start out in a synchronized state. What you see on the x-axis is the power of the injected signal. Here the power is too weak. It doesn't affect the oscillators, but you can maybe see that about here there is a slight pulling of the frequency, and then the line width, the quality of the signal is deteriorating. You can see it also here when you measure the line width that it's actually going up. Maybe it's starting already here. So we are perturbing the signal, and at some point the oscillators decide to injection lock to it. Then the line width improves dramatically, and we have now a better defined state, so the power also goes up. But what is interesting is you can see here in the power spectral density that there are some jumps, and if you analyze that more carefully, you can see that the peak power shows a bifurcation. So when the injection locking increases, we get two states. We bifurcate into a high power state and a low power state. We can identify those as the parallel state where both oscillators are, let's say, at zero phase, and then an antiparallel state where one oscillator is at zero and the other one is at 180 degrees. So this is the first evidence that you can indeed phase binarize spin-hole nano oscillator arrays. You can look at the same system, but now instead of changing the power, we fix it to 0 dBm, and we change the injection locking frequency. Now, when we perturb them this way, they actually break up into two signals. And then it looks like one of them has a lower intrinsic frequency, so it decides to injection lock first, and then later the other one also injection locks. And again, you can see that there are steps here, and there's a huge step over here. So what is happening is, again, some sort of bifurcation where you have two possible states. This is the high power parallel state. This is a low power anti-parallel state. We can look at this with phase resolved Brilliant light scattering microscopy, which is a very handy tool now to be able to see exactly what the phase is of the spin waves in the oscillator. So with our reference at 90 degrees, this is an arbitrary reference, but we take the frequency that we injection lock, and we synchronize the BLS microscope to that frequency, and we only detect signals that are now in phase at 90 degrees. And what we see is that in this anti-parallel state, the first oscillator is in phase and the second oscillator is out of phase. If we change the reference 180 degrees, the microscope then again will pick up spin wave intensity in oscillator 2 and not oscillator 1. And in the anti-parallel state, we can see that both oscillators are exactly the same, and they are exactly out of phase with respect to the reference. So clearly, we can prove with optical microscopy that this is the electrical situation is indeed the fact that we have parallel and anti-parallel states that can be generated. And the last experiment I want to show is where we have extended this to 4 oscillators. Again, we start out in a synchronized state, and it is possible that there's even some jumps here in the synchronized state that they might want to break up into different states already there. Then, as we increase the injected power, the system becomes injection locked, and again we see clear states here. So this is probably an anti-parallel state, and then it's a completely parallel state. And we can see here that this is the parallel state. This is an intermediate state where one of the oscillators is out of phase, and then we have a very low power state where they are canceling out each other. We can do the same thing as a function of injected frequency, but maybe more interestingly is to look at again the phase BLS results. Again, we see that now we have 4 oscillators. This is a trace of the upper one. This is a trace of the lower one. We can see that oscillator 1 and 4 are connected, are coupled in phase. So are oscillator 2 and 3, but these two groups are then connected in antiphase. We can prove that again if we change the reference signal. And when we change the external conditions, we can achieve a fully synchronized state, which just shows that all the oscillators are now operating at the same phase. So with that, I will conclude. We have, I hope I've shown to you that we can get synchronization in long chains and two-dimensional arrays. We can use voltage control to control individual oscillators. And now we've also demonstrated Memristor control mutual synchronization and the first steps towards spin-Hall nano oscillator-based icing machines. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's many interesting result, Professor Akama. So now is there any question or comment?
Johan, thanks for joining the seminar and giving wonderful talk. I have a question on your Memristor thing. So you have a silicon nitride, then aluminum oxide, MgO, then cobalt and boron. So when you apply voltage, does the MgO supply oxygen to cobalt and boron, or what happens physically?
Yeah, we haven't checked any of this, and I am not a Memristor expert. So unfortunately I don't have a good answer to that. We have changed we've changed stacks a little bit since then. We've also changed how we make the processing. So we have now much better control of that. And I would like to refer that question to, for example, Akash Kumar in the group, who is now the expert following up after Mohammed Saidinejad on this. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that right now, but I think it exists. The answer exists.
But cobalt and boron is affected.
Cobalt and boron is affected. Its magnetic anisotropy is affected, but I don't think we see any effect on itself when we create this conducting bridge. So it is, all this Memristor action is happening in the dielectric, and we're not affecting the cobalt iron boron itself with this bridge, if that was your question.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
There's another question. Is Professor Rawat, please?
Yeah. Hello. Hi. Thank you, Professor Ackerman. I just have a very simple question. I mean, looking at this two-dimensional array of these constrictions, or instead of a linear one, what do you think is better in terms of the power output of your SHNOs? If I go for, say, suppose a linear combination of 4 in line rather than 2 by 2, is there any advantage of going for two-dimensional one compared to the linear one?
There is no single answer to that question. When we measure these things, we measure them with 50 ohm impedance lines. So ideally, we would like our device to be at 50 ohm. If we make a very long chain, our device can be at several kilo ohms, and that makes for a very poor measurement. If we make many oscillators in parallel, our device can be at single ohm, and that again, that means actually most of the resistance now comes from the leads, and that also makes for a very poor measurement. So we want to, depending on material choice, because the resistivity of these materials are very different. If we do tungsten cobalt iron boron, very thin cobalt iron boron, versus platinum nickel iron, where nickel iron is usually a little thicker, the resistance is very different. Of course, you can potentially, when you want to design a circuit eventually, you can make your electronics optimized for a kilo ohm device. So I don't. I think there are so many other parameters here that it's not obvious that you should pick.
May I ask another question, a very simple one, Professor Fukuma?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is regarding the things that you mentioned, that you also observe the spin wave by Boolean scatterings and other things. So do I understand correctly that when we have this auto oscillation being set up in this constriction, when you pass the current, the spin wave is sort of taking away the energy from that? Are they desirable or undesirable? Or, I mean, you understand my point?
Yeah.
So if they're undesirable, how can we minimize them? I mean, is it based on the, the control of the constriction size, or the geometry of this constriction, or the boundary, how far the boundary, so that the spin waves are also not reflecting back into the system?
Mm. That again is a very big question. It depends on what you want to achieve. So we have a paper where the entire goal was to create propagating spin waves from a device like this. So there, obviously, the goal was to do exactly that. And others have also published on that, because in magnonics, or if you want to use spin waves per se, you need to be able to create them and propagate them over distances.
Exactly.
But we are not necessarily requiring spin waves in our devices. All we want are interacting oscillators.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I would say that it's the best thing in our case is to have something that is tunable like this between, more strongly localized and less strongly localized. Because if we go even less localized, we will lose additional energy through spin waves. We have unpublished data where we show that we can get spin wave vector dependent synchronization, which is predicted numerically. But it's quite a weak effect, whereas the strongest effect is still probably the direct dipolar coupling between oscillators. So you can get a lot of coupling between oscillators without having propagating spin waves.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, I have the one question. The first part of your talk is that when you increase that injected current, then is that we can see that really good is the locking state. Mm-hmm. But is the final part of your talk is that actually is that last part. Then is that when you increase the current, you can see that some is the bifurcation state or the something. What is the reason? Did you do something else? Is that compared to that is that first part of the talk?
I don't know what you mean the first part. Do you talk about the mutual synchronization? Is that the first part?
Mutual synchronization, you can just see that one locking state at that is the high injecting current. But is the last part is that you can see the something different behavior.
Yes, I think the answer lies here. If in the mutually synchronized state, this is what you have. They all, or ideally, they all are in phase and they have positive coupling between them. If you inject on this on the fundamental frequency, you will strengthen this case. This is the only thing that will happen. You cannot get a bifurcation when you inject at the fundamental frequency. If you inject at twice the frequency, there is now a degeneracy because you can injection lock. This is the intrinsic frequency. You can decide to injection lock here, or you can injection lock here. It is less. It is actually, you need some nonlinearity in the system for this to work. Otherwise, they might not lock at all. But there is now a degeneracy such that you can have 0 and 180 degrees states, and that is what drives the bifurcation. There is. So all the data I showed here is when you inject at twice the frequency. We inject at 18.7 gigahertz, but the device is operating at 9.35 gigahertz.
You apply that additional is the 2F component. With that is that some F component is that you add both in the devices.
we ideally inject only 2F.
Only 2F with the DC current.
So we have a DC current to drive the oscillator, and then we inject a microwave current, which is at twice the frequency of the additional. Yeah.
Thank you. So with that, now is the time is over. Is that we should close this session. Thank you very much for that. Is the all of the speaker, and that is that the people can join here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you again.
See you.